Welcome to our program on the First Punic War, 264 to 241 BC, sponsored by the Mattituck-Laurel Library and presented by John Ribeiro. John Ribeiro is the former Suffolk County Assistant District Attorney, former Captain, Armor, United States Army, and aficionado of historical battles. The First Punic War was the first of three wars between the Roman Republic and the Carthaginian or Punic Empire that resulted in the destruction of Carthage. The First Punic War was fought primarily to establish control over the strategic island of Sicily.
The Punic Wars changed the course of Western history. Prior to Rome engaging with Carthage, the focus of the development and history of Europe was focused on the Eastern Mediterranean and Western Asia. For example, you had the Greek city-states. You had before that, the states in Mesopotamia. You had Babylon, you had Assyria, you had the rise of Egypt, and then you had the rise of Persia, and then you had the wars between different Greek city-states, and eventually the conquest of Greece by Macedonia and the invasion of Persia by Alexander the Great, which took Europeans all the way to the edges of India. Alexander died in 332 BC. And when he died, he did not name a successor. He supposedly said, when asked who he left his kingdom to the strongest. So his empire shattered into different kingdoms. His general Ptolemy took Egypt. Antigonus One-Eye took Macedonia. And by taking Macedonia, he got Greece. Seleucus took the Western Persian Empire and the littoral of the Eastern Mediterranean, what we would call the Middle East. Another one of his generals took Thrace. So the successor states were now fighting each other to see who would control most. Carthage was not involved in any of that, although interestingly, Alexander had declared them an enemy before he invaded Persia. Carthage was founded by colonists from the Phoenician state of Tyre and the Phoenician cities along the coast. The name Punic War, it comes from the Roman name for Carthaginians and Phoenicians, which is Puni. So when Rome and Carthage are developing their own polities, they're not involved in this, and basically Europe is facing eastward. That will change with the Punic Wars. Next slide, please.
These are the powers in the Mediterranean at the time.
You'll notice in the Western Mediterranean, there are two powers, two major powers. Rome, which has just conquered most of Italy, although it isn't quite settled in a couple of areas, notably the Po Valley, where they're still fighting the Celts, although they've beaten them. And in southern Italy, near the Boot, you have what is known as Magna Graecia, or Greater Greece, which are Greek colonies such as Tarentum, and several others. Also, you have on the island of Sicily another Greek colony, Syracuse, which featured prominently in the Peloponnesian War. But the major power in that basin is Carthage, which, as you can see by looking at this map, not only controls much of North Africa, it controls the southern part of the Iberian Peninsula, the Balearic Islands, Sardinia, Corsica, and a good piece of Sicily. Next slide.
Carthage and Rome, 300 BC. In this comparison, Carthage was the preeminent power in the Western Mediterranean, primarily a naval power, rich in agriculture and trade, and they entered at least 3 treaties with Rome, mostly favorable to Carthage. Rome, on the other hand, was a preeminent power on the Italian peninsula, primarily a land power, rich in agriculture and Italian trade routes, and dominated Italy through a system of alliances.
Now, Rome had been at war off and on and mostly on for almost 300 years. They had originally been subject to the Etruscan kings, and Etruria was a state north of on the western coast of Italy from where Rome was, not present-day Tuscany. They threw off that rule and set up a republic. They then fought other city-states in their vicinity in central Italy. Now, what made Rome different from most other people is they didn't always, when they beat somebody, conquer them and treat them poorly. A lot of times they merely let them run themselves, but they set up a series of alliances. The alliances were interesting because they were always between each individual city-state and Rome, not the 3 of them together. And the other city-states would provide Rome with troops when they needed them and would basically follow a Roman foreign policy. Now, Rome had gotten much of their culture indirectly through the Etrurians from Greece. So they were a government and a society of small farmers. And they were agricultural society, but they also sat on the major trade routes that ran through the Italian peninsula. And Rome and her allies basically expanded first north and then south, not without interruption. The Celts invaded Rome in 396 BC and basically extorted a lot of money from them, in fact, leading to the phrase, "Vae victis, woe to the vanquished." So the Romans then began to push the Celts further north in Italy, and eventually they were going to conquer them. They also began moving south, not against Magna Graecia, but against a bunch of Italian tribes in the Apennine Mountains who were not Latin speakers. And those people wound up leading Rome into its first conflicts with the Greek colonies in southern Italy, and through them to their first war with a foreigner who was Pyrrhus of Epirus. Next slide.
The Roman
army.
Rome's was a conscript army, and one's position in that army depended on one's wealth. You paid for your own equipment, the number of prior campaigns, and whether you were from a Roman ally.
Now, the Roman army was in transition. Again, because of the Greek influence, the Romans in the early days of their republic fought in a phalanx. Phalanx is a mass infantry formation where the principal weapon is a spear, not for throwing, but for stabbing. The Romans, by the time of the First Punic War, are getting away from that. They're beginning to loosen up their formation, so they're famous for having 3 lines of battle. The first line are basically the young poor. They're lightly armed troops, slings, javelins. They basically run out and skirmish. The second line are heavy infantry, but they're not veteran heavy infantry. The veteran heavy infantry is the third line. Now, in the picture before you, you see a Roman military formation from later in the Republic or the early Empire. You'll notice the shields are rectangular. At the time of the Punic Wars, they were oval. The Romans are carrying a short sword called a gladius hispaniensis, the Spanish sword, which becomes more and more their principal weapon for close infantry combat. The Greeks are terrified of that weapon because they don't find they're dead and wounded with a nice little spear hole in them. Their limbs are hacked off, they're gutted like fish, they're missing limbs. This formation is called a testudo, or tortoise. The Romans would use it to approach city walls or an enemy formation that was sending arrows and stuff in their direction. A Roman veteran was a man who had fought in 10 campaigns. Now, each Roman provided his own equipment, and most of them were farmers, which meant the Romans initially, like most other people in the ancient world, fought in the summer between planting and harvesting. However, the Romans eventually began a campaign for longer periods of times, and sometimes the armies were in formation for a year or two on end. The way the Romans made up for their losses was loot and slaves. Next slide. Here you see a Roman soldier from the appropriate period. The shield's a little bit off, but it's pretty on the money. You'll notice the metal boss in the middle of the shield. That's used as an offensive weapon. They would smash that into an opponent's face. The sandals he is wearing are called caligae. They have hobnails on the bottom. A future Roman emperor, Tiberius Germanicus Drusus, who grew up on Roman military camps on the Rhine River, used to have a little soldier suit, so to speak. And the troops loved him, and they gave him his nickname of Little Boots, Caligula. You'll notice the helmet is not quite what you expect from the helmets you've obviously seen in movies like Ben-Hur. The Roman is also carrying a pilum. They went away from spears and went to javelins. Now, the beauty of the pilum is the head is tempered, but the shaft is not. So if you threw it at somebody and it hit his shield, it would bend, so he couldn't pull it out. If it hit the ground, it would bend, and he couldn't throw it back. The Roman is wearing chainmail, which was invented by the Celts. They will use basically that into the empire when they will change their uniform to plate armor called lorica segmenta. Next slide. This is a Carthaginian soldier. They wore Greek-style helmets called Phrygian helmets. You'll notice his shield is round. That's from the Greek influence. The Greek word for an infantryman is hoplite, which is in part named because of the shield they carried. He's carrying a spear, which is the basic weapon. But the Carthaginians did not fight in a phalanx for the simple reason that Carthaginians only fought in their own army in defense of their city. They hired mercenaries to do their fighting, and you can't put together a phalanx out of people from 6 different languages and 8 different cultures. Next slide.
Carthaginian troops. Carthage used mercenary troops, Libyans, Numidians, Spaniards, Celts, Ligurians, Greeks, with Carthaginian officers. Carthaginians only served in the army in defense of the city.
Next slide. This is Midian Cavalry. They're from North Africa, just past basically in the littoral. Numidians were famous and fearsome light cavalrymen. You'll notice that the horse does not wear a bridle, a reins, or a bit. He merely has a rein or a collar around his neck. The Numidians used short, lightweight javelins. They would carry 5 or 6 at a time, ride up, throw them, and ride away. One of the advantages the Carthaginians would have in the Second Punic War, more than they used them in the first, was their cavalry. And the Numidians were probably the best light cavalry in the world. Next slide. This is the Balearic Slinger. They're from the Balearic Islands. They were also mercenaries. What made the Balearic Slingers formidable is they're like the longbowmen of medieval England. They trained for this. They also, unlike a lot of slingers in the ancient world, didn't use rocks in their slings. They cast sling shot out of lead. And they were known to actually be able to kill a man by hitting him in the helmet with that slingshot. They were very formidable light troops. They would skirmish ahead of the Carthaginian formation. Next slide. This is an Iberian. Now, Carthage had Iberian mercenaries, but they also had Iberian allied troops. They usually fought in the infantry formations. There was sometimes light infantry and sometimes heavy infantry. This is a light infantryman. You will notice he is carrying a hand weapon that looks somewhat like a Gurkha kukri. This is called the falcata. This was the primary sword that the Carthaginians used, and it was derived from the same type sword that the Greeks used, although the Greeks also had a straight sword called a zippos. Next slide.
The prelude to war, Magna Graecia. Greek states had colonies in southern Italy. Some Greek colonies sought alliance with Rome, others opposed Roman influence.
Now, the Romans had a commonality with some of the Greek city-states in the Magna Graecia. And that were the Oceans and several other people from the Apennine Mountains, which is the spine of mountains that runs down the center of Italy. Rome had been fighting these people for years. They also, the Oceans and their confederates also started attacking some of the Greek city-states. So working on the principle of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, some of these people reached out to the Romans, and Roman influence began to seep into southern Italy. Some of the other Greek city-states didn't like that, especially since Rome was the big boy in the neighborhood. And they decided to go outside of Italy and seek help. Next slide.
Pyrrhus of Epirus, 319 to 272 BC. In 281 BC, Tarentum asked for assistance against Rome from Pyrrhus, king of the Greek city of Epirus.
Now, Pyrrhus was related to the Macedonian royal house. He was basically king of that pink area on the map, which is Epirus, which included a city and various other things. He was also a formidable general. He seemed to have been preferred to be a general on the move than a king of his city-state. He was always looking for new lands to conquer. So when he was asked by Tarentum to help him fight the Romans, he agreed. Next slide.
The Pyrrhic War. Pyrrhus of Epirus crossed into Italy with 25,000 men. Due to his superior cavalry, his elephants, and his deadly phalanx infantry, Pyrrhus defeated the Romans in the Battle of Heraclea in 280 BC. The Pyrrhic War was the first time the Romans faced elephants.
Now, elephants presented a lot of problems for somebody that had never faced them, and even some people that had. They had an amazing impact on cavalry. Horses couldn't stand the smell of elephants, and they would stampede before an elephant got anywhere near them. Of course, the elephants are also tanks with trunks, and they could really mess up an infantry formation if they were kept under control and did what the side that had them wanted them to. This was the first time the Romans faced elephants. It wouldn't be the last, but they would adopt to them. Next slide.
Pyrrhic victory. Pyrrhus invaded Apulia in 279 BC and met the Romans in the Battle of Asculum, where Pyrrhus won another costly victory. In the end, the Romans lost 6,000 men and Pyrrhus 3,500, including many officers. Pyrrhus later famously commented on his victory at Asculum by saying, "If we are victorious in one more battle with the Romans, we shall be utterly ruined."
Now, Pyrrhus is the heir to the Hellenic tradition of war. Going back to the Greek city-states, when they were going to fight each other, they would say, "I'll meet you on a flat piece of ground on Tuesday afternoon," and they would go at it with their phalanxes. Eventually, one side would ask for a truce to bury their dead, at which point the other side would always agree. The side that made the request had lost the war or the battle, and then terms were worked out. The Romans didn't do war like the Greeks did. With the Romans, war was a zero-sum game. They won or you did. And Pyrrhus, who won all of these battles, just couldn't understand why the Romans kept fighting him. But the Romans were not going to do anything with Pyrrhus until he was out of Italy. Next slide.
Prelude to War Sicily. The Mamertines, sons of Mars, were a band of Italian mercenaries originally hired by Syracuse. Eventually, the Mamertines deserted and seized the Greek colony of Messana, which is modern Messina, about 288 BC, and they plundered the surrounding territory.
Now, Syracuse and Carthage decided to move against the Mamertines, who then, first they pleaded for Carthage to help them, and Carthage got there ahead of Syracuse and took over control of the citadel and kicked the Mamertines out. They then appealed to Rome. Now, the Roman Senate didn't like the idea of supporting somebody who had thrown out the legitimate government of the city. Across from Sicily, you will see Selaum. The Mamertines did the same thing to that city. The difference was the Romans sent an army and he kicked the Mamertines out. So when the Mamertines asked the Romans for aid, the Romans understood if they did this, it would mean war with Carthage. The Roman Senate said no, but the popular assembly of tribes said yes, and Rome went into Sicily. Go ahead.
The Romans enter Sicily. When Hero II of Syracuse blockaded Messana, the Mamertines appealed to and received support from the Carthaginians. Unfortunately, the Carthaginians refused to leave. Tired of the Carthaginian occupation, the Mamertines asked the Romans for help to dislodge them.
Next slide.
The Romans, under the command of Appius Claudius Caudex, invaded Messana. When he heard the Romans were coming, the Carthaginian general decided to withdraw from Messana.
Now, when the Carthaginians heard that the Romans were going to come to Sicily, they basically scoffed, because to do that, the Romans had to cross a body of water. Not a great body of water, but a body of water, the Straits of Messina. And the Romans had no navy. Whatever naval or ships they had available were from their allies. So the Carthaginians basically scoffed, except the Romans took either 2 or 4 legions across the Straits of Messina and got into Sicily. Next slide.
Regretting his decision, the Carthaginian general allied himself with Hero II of Syracuse and attacked Messana. The Romans forced Syracuse to capitulate.
The Romans attacked southwest from Messana and beat a combined army of Carthaginians and the army of Syracuse. Hero II, the tyrant of Syracuse, which is a job title, not a way of life, then allied with Rome, which guaranteed them a steady food supply on the island, even if the Carthaginian navy interfered. The Romans then began to prepare to advance to the southern coast, to the town of Aggregatum, which was one of Carthage's major supply bases on the island of Sicily. Next slide.
The tentative Carthaginian general, who had lost the strategic initiative by permitting the Rome's invasion, was crucified by the Carthaginian leadership.
2 things of note. In Carthage, if you lost as a general, you were probably going to get crucified, or as an admiral, you were probably going to get crucified. It's not really good for the morale of the troops, and it certainly isn't good for the morale of the general. The other thing is, because of the Bible and biblical history, we always associate crucifixion with the Romans. The Romans didn't invent crucifixion. It probably, we know it at least goes back to the Greeks, and it may have gone back farther. The Romans learned about it again through their friends, the Etruscans. The Carthaginians used crucifixion frequently. There's at least 2 or 3 ranking officers in the Punic Wars that, because of their failure against Rome, wound up on a cross. Next slide.
In 262, the Romans moved against the fortified city of Aggregatum. After Roman forces defeated a Carthaginian army that had been sent to lift the siege, they brutally sacked the city. Rome was not interested in restoring the status quo. They sought to expel Carthage from Sicily.
Aggregatum would be the subject of a counterattack within the next few years from up in northwestern Sicily at another Carthaginian stronghold, Panormis. The Carthaginians would retake Aggregatum, but they would then raze it to the ground because they didn't think they could hold it. And what that meant was, by losing Aggregatum, they were basically going to confine themselves militarily to the western end of Sicily with the three cities of Panormis, Droponum, and Libeiro. Next slide.
Rome needs a navy. Rome realized that defeating Carthage would require a navy that could attack the Carthaginian homeland in Africa and thwart Carthage's ability to resupply its beleaguered coastal cities in Sicily. To counter Carthage's naval superiority, Rome undertook a rapid armament program, building and training a navy in a matter of months.
Fortuitously for the Romans, a Carthaginian quinquereme washed ashore in Italy, either as a result of battle damage someplace or from a storm. The Romans found it, reverse engineered it so they could build it, and began building a series of quinqueremes. Since quinqueremes relied on rowers, at least in part, the Romans built a series of bleachers, just like you find at a high school basketball game, on the shore, and they used that to train people to row the ships. Next slide. Now the Romans, go ahead.
The Corvus. After early losses at sea, the Romans determined that they could exploit their own superiority in close quarter fighting by equipping their ships with a hooked gangplank, the Corvus or crow, that allowed Roman marines to grapple, board, and capture Carthaginian ships.
Now, ships equipped with a Corvus were slower than standard quinqueremes. They were also less maneuverable because the Corvus was probably 30 feet long and 4 feet wide, and it was mounted on a deck in such a way that it could be swung around. However, once you got close to the enemy ship and dropped that spike through his deck, he couldn't move. And at that point, Roman infantry would do what Carthaginian infantry or marines couldn't, which was fight on basically a land battle at sea. Now, if you look at the picture on the right side of the slide, that's a cross-section of a quinquereme. Now, when you hear the phrase quinquereme, you think 5 banks of oars. That's not true. It's 3 banks of oars. The quinquereme refers to the number of rowers. In the top bank, there's 2 men on each oar. In the second bank, there's 2 men on each oar. And in the bottom bank, there is 1 man on each oar. Next slide.
This is an illustration of Roman military crossing the gangplank.
Once the Romans invented the Corvus, their battles against the Carthaginian navy began to become massacres. The Carthaginians just couldn't stand against them. And slowly, 2 things happened. The Romans gained predominance at sea, overcoming the major naval power in the Western Mediterranean. And also, as they get better, they eventually get rid of the Corvus because their seamanship becomes better than that of the Carthaginians, and they can fight a normal naval battle in antiquity with ramming and maneuvering. Next slide.
The Battle of Cape Ecnomus, 256 BC.
This is a naval battle.
At the Battle of Cape Ecnomus, 256 BC, the Roman quinqueremes carried a total crew of 420, 300 of whom were rowers and the rest marines. The Roman commanders were Marcus Atilius Regulus, Lucius Manlius, and Vulso Longus. The Carthaginian commanders were Hamilcar and Hanno. Roman losses were 24 ships sunk, 10,000 killed. Carthaginian losses, 30 ships sunk, 64 ships captured, 30 to 40,000 killed or captured.
Now, one of the things that makes the Punic Wars interesting is the Carthaginians didn't seem particularly imaginative when giving people first names. You will run into some people who are named differently, but you're going to run into a whole bunch of people named Hamilcar, Hasdrubal, and Hanno, and also Hannibal. And so sometimes you'll have to look at the last name because, for example, Hamilcar Barca, who was Hannibal's father, was succeeded by his son-in-law Hasdrubal, although he had a son named Hasdrubal, who therefore was known as Hasdrubal the Handsome. That was in Spain. Next slide.
You will notice in the illustration the battering ram on the front of the quinquereme.
They're made out of bronze, normally. They weigh several hundred pounds. Much later, at the Battle of Actium, where Octavian Caesar, who eventually became Augustus Caesar, defeated Antony and Cleopatra, to mark his victory, he built a wall on the shore which was studded with the bow rams of the Antonine ships that he had sunk or taken.
And these were rams that have been fairly recently brought up from the bottom of the sea. The Roman rostra battering ram and the Carthaginian ram with some gouges from head-on collisions. The Battle of Tunis, 255 BC.
Now, Rome was not going to just play defense on the island of Sicily. And this is one of those lessons that the Carthaginians should have learned, but didn't learn. Same as they should have learned from Pyrrhus of Epirus, that war with Rome was not like war with anybody else. The Romans decided they were going to expand the war and take it to Carthage. So they put together a fleet and they set sail and landed on the North African coast and began moving inland towards the city of Carthage. And they had a battle in the area of what is now Tunis. Next slide.
The Battle of Tunis, 255 BC. The African campaign of 256-255 met with early success. Romans under the consul Atilius Regulus ravaged the African countryside and won a smashing victory that forced Carthage to sue for peace. When Rome offered terms that were punitive, Carthage hired the Spartan Xanthippus to reorganize its army. Xanthippus lured Regulus into a battle on open ground where Carthage's war elephants and its advantage in cavalry overwhelmed the Romans.
Now, this is a diagram of basically the Battle of Tunis. And it's almost the forerunner of what the Romans are going to run into in the Second Punic War with Hannibal. You'll notice in this particular instance, in the center, you have a citizens' militia. That's Carthaginians. Why? Their city's being threatened. You'll notice on both sides of the citizens' militia, you have mercenaries, newly hired mercenaries and veteran mercenaries, and the cavalry is on the flanks. That's pretty standard in ancient warfare. The cavalry covers the flanks so you don't get attacked from the side. What makes this almost uniquely Carthaginian is you have an attack line of 100 elephants and the cavalry attacks both flanks. Next slide.
Only 2,000 Romans from a force of over 15,000 survived to be evacuated by the Roman fleet. The consul Atilius Regulus was captured. He would later be tortured to death. Compounding the disaster, A storm wrecked nearly the entire evacuation fleet before it reached Italy. As many as 90,000 men drowned, taking with them Rome's hopes of invading Africa and forcing a quick end to the war. Attention turned again to Sicily and the brutal war of attrition.
Now, Tullius Regulus had been sent by Carthage back to Rome to basically foster a truce and maybe a peace treaty. And they did so by making a promise to return to Carthage. When he got to Rome, he told the Senate, keep on fighting. He then returned to Carthage where they killed him. Okay, the Battle of Panormis.
This is the Battle of Panormis, 251 BC.
Now, what had happened while that was going on in Africa, a lot of the little cities and city-states or polities in central Sicily saw which way the wind was blowing and went over to Rome because the Carthaginians could not stand in an open field battle against the Romans. So by this time, Carthage is pretty much hemmed in on the western end of Sicily. And now the Romans start going for those cities that they still have. Next slide.
The Battle of Panormis, 251 BC. The Roman Lucius Caecilius Metellus commanded the city of Panormis, a city protected with a trench and some walls. The Carthaginian leader, Hasdrubal, led the attack against the city. Metellus lured Hasdrubal into a trap. Roman light infantry stood before the trench protecting the city. Hasdrubal sent his elephants after these men, but it was part of Metellus' plan. He knew the men would be forced into the ditch, but used the opportunity to send his troops on the wall into the fray against the now vulnerable animals.
Now you can see in this particular battle, the Romans have planned for what to do if the Carthaginians use elephants. It's not what will eventually become the standard Roman battle doctrine for fighting elephants, but they've obviously by this time seen weaknesses that they can exploit, and at this battle they exploited them. Next slide.
Now the Romans moved towards Lilith Bayhem. The Siege of Lilith Bayhem. By 250 BC, the Carthaginians held only the cities of Lilith Bayhem and Droponum. These were well fortified and situated on the west coast of Sicily, where they could be supplied and reinforced by sea without the Romans being able to use their superior army to interfere. In mid-250 BC, the Romans besieged Lilith Bayhem with more than 100,000 men, but an attempt to storm Lilith Bayhem failed and the siege became a stalemate.
Now the Romans are faced with a problem, and this is a problem that's going to be almost insoluble till the end of the war, which is dealing with well-fortified positions. I mean, the Carthaginians are down to their last two positions, but they're well-fortified, and the Romans can't get at them unless they either break through or somehow cut them off from the sea, because they can't besiege it. The Carthaginians can get supplied by water. Next slide.
The Battle of Droponum. When Roman reinforcements arrived in Lilith Bayhem, Consul Publius Claudius Pulcher decided to launch a surprise attack on the Carthaginian fleet at Droponum. The Carthaginian admiral, Hasdrubal, reacted quickly once the Roman fleet had been sighted. He ordered his fleet to dash out of the harbor, and his ships escaped. The Roman ships continued to sail into the harbor, where they collided with each other and suffered damage. An unusual thing happened before the battle. The Romans had a tradition of divining the likely fortune of a military endeavor by observing the actions of the sacred chickens. In the early morning, they would be offered food, and if the chickens ate eagerly, the omens were good. If they refused the food, the action was ill-fated. When the solemn ceremony was performed on the way to Drepana, the chickens declined to eat. Infuriated, Pulcher pitched the chickens overboard, exclaiming that if they were not hungry, then perhaps they were thirsty.
Now, this little anecdote also serves to highlight one of the features about Roman military generalship in the Punic Wars and afterwards that is somewhat paramount in understanding them. That is aggression. Rome did not have a political army at this time. It was a conscript army. And the Roman generals were the consuls who had been elected to run Rome for the year. So basically, they have officers, tribunes, but they're also minor politicians, younger people working their way up the political ladder. And a Roman consul wanted glory above all else. So they were, and since they only usually had a year to do it, they tended to be very aggressive, which Pulcher shows with the story of the chickens. The Romans were very religious people. They're almost like the Spartans. And they had augurs that would read entrails before a battle to determine whether or not it was good. They were very superstitious too. And if you were an aggressive general and you only had a year to do what you had to do, you weren't going to let some chickens stand in your way. Next slide.
The Battle of Droponum. The two fleets lined up parallel to the coast. The Roman fleet had its back to the shore and was close to dangerously shallow water. The Carthaginian ships had the freedom to pull back into the open sea or help other ships that were hard-pressed. The Romans lost the battle and 93 of their ships and crew. For the next 7 years, Rome could not afford to build a new navy.
By this point in the First Punic War, the Romans have lost at least 2 fleets. The one at Droponum, the one in the storm after they withdrew from Italy. The Carthaginians were not in much better shape. They had lost a lot of ships because the Romans had been beating them like a drum. But at this point in time, the Romans are still in control of almost all of Sicily, but they no longer can project naval power away from the island and stop Carthage from resupplying Droponum and Libyum from sea.
The Battle of the Agates Islands, 241 BC. The Battle of the Agates Islands was one of the greatest naval battles of antiquity, fought with around 200,000 participants between the Romans, led by Consul Gaius Lutatius Catulus, and the Carthaginians under the command of Hanno, and which ended in a victory of the first. Here are the Agates Islands of Maritimo, Lavanzo, and Favignana. And this is a view from Favignana today. The battle itself, with public funds exhausted in Rome, the Senate decided to impose a heavy loan on the wealthiest men of the state, which would be paid back if the Romans won. In the summer of 242 BC, the new Roman fleet, under the command of the Consul Lutatius Catulus, sailed to Sicily. The Carthaginians had become complacent and they were unprepared. The only Carthaginian fleet available was under Admiral Hanno, but his fleet was heavily burdened with supplies, his crews not battle-tested.
Now, for reasons not necessarily understandable, the Carthaginian plan seemed to have been run the supplies into Libyum and then take some of the garrison of the troop of the town onto the ships and used them as marines. So basically, as the Carthaginians are approaching the western coast of Sicily, the ships are loaded with supplies, but very light on people to defend them.
The Romans quickly gained the upper hand, using their ships' greater maneuverability to ram the Carthaginian vessels. The Romans sank 50 Carthaginian ships, 20 of them with all hands, and 70 were captured along with 10,000 men. However, the battle was hard fought, and the Romans lost 30 ships sunk and another 50 damaged. The rest of the Carthaginian fleet was saved only by an abrupt change in the direction of the wind, allowing them to flee. As the Romans had left their masts, sails, and rigging ashore, they were unable to pursue. The Carthaginian remnants returned to Carthage, where their unsuccessful commander was crucified.
Now, after the Agates Islands, the Carthaginian Senate directed the commander of the Carthaginian troops on Sicily to negotiate a surrender. His name was Hamilcar Barca. And he had basically been doing to the Romans what a Roman general, Fabius the Delayer, would do to his son Hannibal, which was not seeking open battle, but attacking supply lines, ambushing, foraging parties, etc. Hamilcar concluded the peace with the Romans, and the First Punic War was over. Okay. Now, the terms of the treaty between Carthage and Rome were fairly simple. The Carthaginians withdrew from Sicily. The Romans got all of Sicily except for Syracuse, which was now one of their allies. The Carthaginians also had to pay the Romans a large amount of money. In addition, except for, I believe, 10 warships, the Carthaginian battle fleet was to be destroyed, kind of like the Germans after World War I with the surrender. Now, in the immediate aftermath of the war, the Carthaginians began to withdraw their troops from Sicily. The troops were mercenaries. Rather than take them all at once, they sent them over to Carthage in small contingents, and they didn't pay them. I guess they thought they would wait till they all got there, spread out the time that it took to get them there, and then they would pay them. But the troops mutinied. Carthage then wound up fighting a war with their own mercenaries. In fact, it got to the point where Romans suspended payments from Carthage and offered to help them put down the war. Hamilcar Barca suppressed the revolt. However, while that was going on, the Romans also seized Sardinia and Corsica, which were not part of the treaty. That engendered bad feelings in Carthage. So Carthage now has no navy, has lost all of its island possessions, and in an effort to pay off the Romans and survive, they decide to expand their holdings in Spain because Spain has silver mines. So Hamilcar Barca goes to Spain with yet another Carthaginian mercenary force and basically begins to expand Carthaginian power northward from the southern littoral of Iberia up towards the Pyrenees. They'll do it with a series of alliances, and they'll do it with a series of conquests. Hamilcar Barca will be killed in Spain. He'll be succeeded by his son-in-law Hasdrubal the Beautiful, or the Handsome. And the thing about Hasdrubal's rule that gets interesting is a Roman embassy shows up and asks, "What are you doing in Spain?" And he explains, Hamilcar explains, "We're here to get you the money." But Hasdrubal strikes a deal with the Romans that the Romans will, the Carthaginians will stay south of, I think it's the Ebro River. And there is a city south of the Ebro River called Saguntum. And Saguntum is a friend of Rome. And even though that's going to be in the Carthaginian sphere of influence, Hasdrubal agrees that that city will not be taken by the Carthaginians. And so at the end of the First Punic War, we have laid the groundwork for the second.
So at this time, I want to, on behalf of Mattituck-Laurel Library, thank John Ribeiro for this presentation on the First Punic War. He has graciously volunteered to tell us the story of the battles between Carthage and Rome that will eventually lead to the famous account of Hannibal and his elephants crossing the Alps.